Right, so we are going to be talking about whether or not gear matters. And unless you're someone like Roger Deakins, then absolutely, yeah, gear is essential. And it's even essential to Roger Deakins. And I say this from this point of view. When he goes into a scene or a story, he has a brief on how the image should look. And because he is so good at his job, he knows how to do that creatively. And then based on that creative endeavor, he knows which lighting he needs to use to support that. So the gear is essential to even Roger Deakins. It just is a different approach for him. He comes from a artistic point of view. Now, for myself and many hopefully like me, it is a different process. So when I started off, I used the mobile phone for videos. And then I purchased the camera. So I went through a process of learning how to shoot a bit of video, wanting to take it further, a bit of research, and then I purchased the camera. After a while of using that camera and getting better at it, I then decided, okay, how do I improve the lighting? So then you go down that rabbit hole and then you start looking at lighting on which will be suitable for you and help you do the things that you need to do. So then you buy more lighting. And then you go down the rabbit hole again because you're going to be learning about to use those lights. So it is a constant process of learning and buying and learning and buying, and you're back and forth all the time. And it is a long process because there is so much to learn and so much to know. Now, the question of does gear matter, I'll apply this to a recent interview that I'd done for a client, and she wanted this to be done at her home. Now, in order to know what I needed to do to achieve this, I had to go to the client's home and assess what area that I'd be working in. And in order for me to fulfill the image that I wanted to see and the client wanted to see, I wanted to make sure that there was enough room or enough depth so I could provide a blurry background. I needed to make sure that I could shoot into the aisle of the room so that gives it a bit more depth. And I wanted to shoot in the shadow of her face and a light from the other side. So we found the composition that would support that. But by doing that, I instantly noticed a problem. And this is where the gear comes into it. Now, the issue is that at the back of the wall, there are double doors which lead out to the garden. So I checked the time at which the sun was coming around because she wanted to do this at 2 o'clock. And lo and behold, at 2 o'clock, the sun is positioned right at those doors for a few hours. So that meant that those doors were going to be completely overexposed if I didn't tackle it. Now, the initial way that I was going to do this was to buy some ND gel roll, which was 3 stops. And this would reduce the door light by 3 stops, which would have been fantastic. Now, I was going to put shears on the other side of the door just to make it look pretty and avoid any distractions that was in the back garden. I had a gut feeling that the ND gel roll wouldn't come in time, and it didn't. So in the meantime, what I'd done was I thought, right, okay, I'll use some diffusion. I'll do a double diffusion on the window, and then I will put some shears against the window, and then that will help solve the distraction, and it would eliminate any of the light that was coming in, or so I thought. Now I tested this and it only reduced it by 1 stop. So that had another problem. Now, in order for me to correctly expose this, that meant then that I would have had to have used an ND filter on the camera, which is fine. But the camera that I'm using only has 8 stops of dynamic range. Now, with things like the Blackmagic, the Pocket, or the 6K and the 4K, depending on the ISO that you select, determines whereby how much dynamic range you have in the highlights. So I don't know which particular ranges they are, but I know this can range from anything between 2 stops of dynamic range in the highlights to 4 or perhaps even 5. But with the Panasonic G7, you only have 2 stops of dynamic range in the highlights. So that's a problem, because it means then in order to get that window down to an acceptable level, I had to use 4 stops of ND. No problem, that's fine, that's been sorted. But then you incur another problem. In order to expose the client's face correctly, you have to make sure that your key light can also compensate for that 4 stops of reduction. Not only that, you have to make sure that whatever diffusion or how you modify that light, the light needs to have enough output power to compensate for that as well, because you're not just compensating, I'm using the word compensate a lot, but you're not just compensating for the 4 stops, you're also compensating for the bloody diffusion. Thankfully, it's 100 watt and it just cut it. But here's where it could have been improved, and this is why gear does matter. Had the ND gel come, I could have put that on, that would have reduced it by 3 stops. It also would have cut down the ambient light in the room, but that wouldn't have been a problem. I could have put the shears on, and that might have helped with another extra half stop. So that would have meant I would only really needed perhaps a half or 1 stop of ND on the lens. Now, that would have meant the key light wouldn't have had to have fought 4 stops in order to get back to a point of normal exposure. It would have had more leeway because it's only fighting 1 stop, which would have meant was I would have had more options of diffusion. I could have double diffused it, but I didn't, and the image still looks nice and soft. But to give you an example, it's nighttime now, and the light is only on, I think, the lower setting to get it a correct exposure. So I'll turn it to the maximum power. Right, so even then, even if I had had the ND on the window, as you can see, I'm completely overexposed now. I'll put that back down. Right, so had I had the ND on the window, that would have darkened the room, which meant this would have had a better chance because it can do a better job at lighting a room in the dark than it can when it's competing with the sun. Therein lies why gear does matter, and it's important to understand the technical depth of your equipment, because it could have been that I couldn't have met the client's needs because the gear didn't or wasn't up to the job. But thankfully in this instance it cut it, and even though I wasn't happy with the left hand side whereby the window was a little bit, it's still overexposed a little bit, but it's not too bad. But it did allow me, because it's a nice white area, it allowed me to put the customer's logo there. So that's how I got away or mitigated that. Now, I might not always be in that position, so the next investment that I've got to make is a better light first. That is, before I even touch the camera, because I know how to work within the stops of the camera. I'm thinking about something like a 300 watt, whether it's the aperture or something else, but that is what I'm trying to say. Gear is important because it needs to support the work that you're doing. And that's my takeaway on that. Hopefully put anything in the comments, what experience you've had where people say that gear doesn't matter, but actually when you've gone to do a job, gears let you down because of the snowball effect, because of that one window. And it was really only that point in the room where that composition was the best composition. If we had turned the camera a little bit to left or more right, it wouldn't have looked as good. So that's what we were dealing with. So put down in the comments, what issues have you had with your camera equipment or your lighting? What have you had to overcome where people say gear doesn't matter when it bloody does? So I'm going to leave you with that. Yeah, so if you like the content, please give me a thumbs up. It would help me massively, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.